So I'd like to welcome everyone. I'm showing up as Hannah Solomon, that's my daughter. And I think just because both of my college age kids are home, you know, it got a little convoluted, but we just wanted to welcome everyone. This is the Coalition to Defend Special Education meeting out of Massachusetts Advocates for Children. I'm Janine Solomon, and Leslie Lockhart, who is on the line, is my co-chair for the coalition. Our coalition is comprised of advocates, private bar attorneys, public interest attorneys, parents, and other providers. And as I said, we have a lot of ground to cover today. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. I'm going to cover a few of the logistics at the end, but I just wanted to start off with just some acknowledgements and say a little bit about what's currently going on with this crisis. So I want to thank very much Harvard Law School for being hosting today's meeting, and to Mac's Trauma and Learning Policy Initiative, to Susan Cole and Michael Gregory. We're so grateful. We also are very, very thankful for Alex Horn being on the line from Harvard, who's helping to be the glue behind the scenes to help this webinar take place, or the Zoom meeting take place. I wanted to just briefly thank and introduce our two presenters today from NESCA. We do want to also thank Dr. Ann Helmus from NESCA. NESCA has been a wonderful partner with MAC over the years. Dr. Nancy Russa and Stephanie Monahan-Blout are our presenters today on the topic of autism and trauma, the intersection, and you all can see that on your screens. They both have tremendous expertise, unparalleled in working not only with students with trauma backgrounds, but also autism. Dr. Monahan-Blout is a pediatric neuropsychologist and a senior clinician at NESCA who specializes in the assessment of clients with complex learning and emotional issues. Dr. Russo is also a pediatric neuropsychologist who has expertise in working with children on the autism spectrum and children with complex profiles. I would suggest, if you all haven't done so, to go to NESCA's website, which is nesca-newton.com. You could get more comprehensive information about their services, as well as our two presenters' bios. Before we begin, as I said, I do want to kind of acknowledge what's currently going on with the COVID-19 crisis. We felt it would be remiss if we just didn't say a few words about it. This is really unprecedented and uncharted territory which we're going through. We did want to let people know that as MAC, we are truly committed, as we have been for 50 years, to students with disabilities and their families. We will be continuing as we navigate these waters with the people that we serve and represent, and assisting low-income individuals and their families at this time of great need and uncertainty. MAC is working as we speak on ways to adjust our programming to address the existing and the emerging needs, and supporting families and charting a course forward. It's really timely that we're talking about this topic of autism and trauma, because not only did the kids, were they impacted before, but being at home without services or with limited services for the next several weeks, potentially longer than that, there will be more trauma, and there's more loss, and families are also under tremendous stress. So our role at MAC will be facilitating the connection with our families to, in order to, you know, cut through some of the isolation, to really have, we're working on a creation of a database, a clearinghouse of resources and information that will help our families, and really also to continue to stay in our role and lead in terms of not only our advocacy, but our efforts with the state and Department of Ed and at the district level to ensure access to supports and services as much as we can right now. not only during these next several months, but in the months ahead, and also as students transition back into school. So I think that will be it. I just will announce the logistics, and then Mike or Alex weigh in if I've missed anything. This is being recorded today. The recording will be available to people after the presentation, along with the PowerPoint, and we're thankful for Dr. Rusa and Monahan Blount for providing that to us. What we're going to do, because there's so much material to get through, we're going to allow the presenters to present their materials, and we're going to do a Q&A at the end. So people can start to put their questions as they arise in the chat box. I will monitor it, and in case there is something that is just, you need a clarification on something they said, I will try to monitor those questions as well, but we will really reserve time at the end. I think that covers it, but Mike or Alex or anyone else chime in if I missed anything.
Can you tell people where the chat box is, Janine?
Yeah, the chat box is right on the bottom of the screen. Do you see that? It says invite participants. Yeah. Do you have that ribbon? Yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's just also people want to go to look for it and then they can't find it and they can't remember how to get to it. So.
Oh, okay. So you were just asking for people in general. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Then they're done that.
All right. So the chat box is at the bottom, and people were typing in it before, but I think we're good. So we're really excited to hear your presentation today. So right ahead.
Thank you. We are really excited to have the presentation. I do wish we were all together in one room and could interact more thoroughly, but given the circumstances, I'm glad we're all not together in one room. So it's the best we can do. And it's great to have this meeting of the minds. As you were speaking, Janine, I had the thought, I'm sure Stephanie did too, that you know, MAC has been an important partner for NESCA over the years. As neuropsychologists, we're primarily responsible for diagnosing and writing reports, and you know, some advocating for students at meetings, but really, we really rely on MAC and all the work you've done around trauma and trauma-sensitive schools to help us advocate, to follow up with legal and advocacy work to make our reports mean anything, really. We really rely on that. And as you'll see throughout the talk, we do rely on MAC's work and the Trauma Learning Policy Initiative. So with that said, I just want to you know, introduce Stephanie and I again. Thank you, Janine, for the introduction. Just to say, we have worked together for about 20 years now. Yeah. We have over that time sort of developed our own specialties. Let me see, I need to get, yes, there we are, the next slide. That's an important thing. So Stephanie has really become, dive deep into trauma and the implications of that for children and learning. And I have pretty much specialized in working with children in the autism spectrum, although we both see kids of all different stripes. And, you know, we think these are somewhat specialties, but over the years, we found that it's really important for us to collaborate, and that these kind of situations of trauma and autism are inextricably linked, and we need each other's expertise at various points. So the first case that I'm going to present, I think, really illustrates that. A child with autism, where the autism was not apparent until after trauma. So let me spend a few minutes just talking about this 7-year-old boy that I saw recently. The parents came to me in an intake and told me that they were very sure he had been traumatized in 1st grade, that he had started coming home, hitting himself in the head, you know, saying, no, no, bad, bad. He became afraid of school. All of his skills regressed, language. He became completely uninterested in anything that reminded him of school, even things that he used to love, like reading and singing and dancing. And it got to the point that he became so afraid that he wouldn't leave the house. somewhere in that process, he started vomiting on the way to school. So he was clearly terrified, had these kind of symptoms of trauma. Is there someone talking in the background? Anyway, when they came into me, he had had a history of some developmental delays in language and social skills, but it had not been.
If you want to talk to, I'll just send you a notice that he's going to a program.
I'm not sure who's talking. Is that something? So let me just go on, unless that's important verbiage back there. But now when I diagnosed him, this little boy came in.
The host can mute everybody that's online.
Okay. When I evaluated this little boy, he met every symptom of autism and presented with a very classic and severe type of autism. He came in the room, he wouldn't engage with me. The ADOS is a test that we give that is full of playful activities to diagnose symptoms of social relatedness and perseverative repetitive interests, which are the classic diagnostic criteria for autism. And he met every criteria. I couldn't get him to activities. He ignored all the toys that I placed out, but he did pick up a plastic fork and tap his thigh with it repeatedly. That was one thing. So that's really repetitive behaviors. He would prefer if his dad and I weren't otherwise structuring him, he would go to the corner of a room and talk to himself with some repetitive phrases that I couldn't understand. He had a lot of sensory sensitivities. So whenever there was a loud noise, he was, tried to block it out. So again, really classic and severe, no reciprocal language. Again, some unintelligible kind of repetitive phrases, scripting. So what do? I wander over to Steph. I say, Stephanie, well, how do we understand this case? This is a kid who wasn't diagnosed with autism, and now at the age of 7, he looks like he has really severe autism. Steph.
Autism, as I remind Nancy, autism is not a neurodevelopmental disorder, and it's neurologically based. It's not something that you can catch at the age of 7. So let's go back and look at the case again.
So we know, obviously I know this, but it does help to have a colleague remind me. So again, we looked back at the history. I'm sorry, I just threw in this slide about the autism diagnosis.
And I think it's important that we did this, though, because this is the mistake that people make. I mean, actually, the first thing I have to say is, like, Nancy and I love people. We love getting away. Neither of us tell jokes really well. And so what we've done is we've given you the punchline before we've given you the whole joke. So, but just bear with us for this. One of the concerns that we have is that people look at the behaviors and they don't look at the whole picture of the child. And that's what the ASD diagnosis reminds us of. So we have not only the 2 things that Nancy's already talked about, but there are other aspects of that are required in order to make a diagnosis of ASD. So Nancy.
Yeah, so the point being that it's present in the early development. Stephanie said, you don't catch this at age 7, it has to have been present. But I think the other point that you might be alluding to, Steph, is that the DSM gives us a checklist. And if someone meets all the criteria on the checklist, we can say, check autism. But as this case and others that we'll present today point out, just meeting those behaviors have meaning, and we need to understand the whole child and the reason for those behaviors. So it encouraged me to go back into the history. And basically, this little kid, I asked the parents to bring in videos of him in early years and bring in any records they had from preschool or kindergarten. And it was pretty clear that he had regressed. He had been more outgoing, more sociable, more talkative when he was in preschool. He had some really cute videos of him dancing around and reading and doing fun things. But he also very clearly had symptoms of autism at that time. He tended to be pretty self-directed. Even when he was reading to himself and not talking to his mom, who was in the room talking to him. And I saw him dancing around at a school presentation where he wasn't interacting with the other kids. He was very much in his own world. And the school records also indicated that he had some, there were a lot of lovely teacher language about we're working on him developing social interactions with other kids. So they were, it was clearly an issue. So the point being that he had this, what I was saying is an emerging autism diagnosis that without this trauma might not have been diagnosed for a few more years, but the trauma presumably increased the severity of the symptoms of autism. So he was functioning reasonably well and making developmental progress. We don't know what his trajectory would have been like without the trauma, but the trauma exacerbated all the problems he had. And post-trauma, he looks more autistic. This is a particular case where we have sort of lower functioning kids who can't explain or talk about what's going on for them. And that makes this identification of trauma very, very difficult. So again, Stephanie and I illustrate the fact that it's too easy to see one condition or the other. It's too easy to be a trauma specialist who only sees trauma. It's too easy to be an autism specialist who only sees autism. We really have to think about how they interact and affect each other. And we will pound that point home. So if we did not take a deep dive into this kid's history and try to understand what had happened, it would be too easy to see him as just having severe autism, and the trauma would be unrecognized and untreated. Stephanie's gonna.
Okay, I'm just gonna make sure I can play with the screen here. Nope. So, Nancy, tell me how to, I'm sorry.
I'm just pushing the right cursor, but if you want me to change slides, I will.
The right cursor.
Why don't I change slides for you?
Okay,
just
all right.
Finger or
we went through a lot of things, but one of the things we didn't do is I forgot to ask how to change the screen, so bear with me here. If you
Well,
can change okay, so I'm going to present, this is my case, and this is a case that came in where I wanted to consult with Nancy. So this is an 8-year-old boy whose behavior is very concerning to his parents and his teachers. He talks to himself. He does a lot of stimming, so he does humming and rocking. He avoids eye contact. His play is very rigid. He's preoccupied with clocks, and he has no friends. Okay. It's not going to go. Nancy, can you change it?
I did.
So again, this is really a concern. Everybody was very concerned about what to do with this kid. And again, this is the rule of a good neuropsychologist is it's important to get a good history. So when I went back and I said,
from those symptoms, you could go down the checklist and say this is autism.
Exactly. So I said, so what was this kid like when he was little? What was, how did he do with walking and talking and, making friends when he was a little kid? And his early milestones were all met at expected times. He had friendships. It was very typical as a young child. You ask, well, when did things change? His behavior changed after attending a summer day camp. He began having nightmares. He began acting out at home. He refused to be alone. He started playing alone at recess. He would act out the same war game over and over and over again. And the other kids started teasing him about being weird. So he started seeing a counselor at school to help him with the social problems and the behaviors in class. And after developing some trust with this person, he disclosed that he had been molested at camp by a junior counselor who told him that if he ever said anything, he would kill his parents. Now, this abuse occurred at the same time every day, which was nap time, rest time, about 1 o'clock. And in his war game, the hero rescues a family and kills all the bad guys with this huge gun that he had invented. Now, that's a pretty, when you go down again to the deep dive through history, that's a pretty classic presentation of PTSD, actually. But again, if you just looked at the behaviors, they meet the checklist. They all fit in. So the point that, again, that as Nancy said, we want to pound in is that differential diagnosis can be hard. They can look the same, and you have to look at the function of the behavior and how and what in the context of the child. A word that we used when we were trying to get ready for this was tapestry, because it's more than just having the strings, it's how they're woven together. And in the behavioral symptoms of trauma and abuse can really mimic autism. They both affect social relationships, the ability to trust and read others accurately, emotional regulation. These are kids who have huge emotional outbursts that last for hours. What does that sound like? Well, it depends where it comes from. The sensory regulation issues are huge with these kids. There's both a hypersensitivity of ASD versus hypoarousal of the sort of being in hypervigilance all the time that you see in people who've been traumatized. And there's a difference between, how do you distinguish between rumination and repetitive thinking? You know, how do you, this kid with the war games, I mean, that was just a classic example of that's sort of what we call traumatic play. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to solve a problem, and he's going over and over and over and over in his mind, how can I do this? How can I fix it? How can I make it better? And this is how he attempted to make sense and get some control and mastery over his world. And we'll talk about that a lot later. So again, how to distinguish this, it calls for a really thorough evaluation. As someone who's not stuck in either a trauma silo or an autism silo. One of the things that Nancy found, which is this really cool thing that was invented by some British people, was it's called the Coventry grid, and it's a grid that kind of looks at it's pretty. It looks at more specific aspects about attachment, but it really sort of it looks at, helps people sort of identify the differences in presentation and sort of some of the social challenges of people who are on the autism spectrum versus people who are really struggling with attachment disorders, which are often a part of trauma.
It's a very lengthy grid, and if you wanted, you could look it up online. I found it online, and it does things like say, okay, if we have attachment, if we have social problems, and tries to distinguish and tease out what is more symptomatic of an attachment or trauma disorder and what's more symptomatic of the social problems of autism. So again, we're not going to bore you with that because we're not diagnosticians for the most part, but if anyone was interested, it's a very nice resource.
Okay, so I'm going to just so this is, I love context. Context is my thing. And so I'm going to give you guys just a little bit of a historical context of trauma, because I think it sort of helps us to understand how things went together. We've talked about trauma since our earliest, the earliest writers that we have talked about trauma. It first really kind of came up to, or sort of was sort of conceptualized in a way together in World War I. And if people have seen the movie, I haven't seen the movie 1917 yet, but I assume that I'm going to see. If you have, you'll get a sense of what these guys went through, who lived in the trenches for 2 weeks at a time with dead bodies around them, and just the massive inhumanity of war. And at this, people came up with the idea of shell shock. At that time, it was kind of a shameful kind of thing, where people who had shell shock were thought to be not strong and very weak kind of people. That was refined through World War II, and the Vietnam War was the time that we really actually first identified this as a disorder, although we thought it was to be really rare. It was PTSD. And in one of our first diagnostic manuals, DSM-1, it was really talked about, a traumatic event was just talked about being outside the range of usual human experience, usually including threats to life or bodily integrity. Again, these are based on the concept of what people went through in war. And it was about men, it was about very specific kinds of events that were just, were life-threatening. And the common denominator was really feelings of intense fear, helplessness, loss of control, and I can't get my camera, sort of annihilation. Now, Judy Herman, if you haven't heard about Judy Herman is really the mother of, she's a person who really pulled our thoughts together about what trauma really might mean. Nancy, can you change the screen a little bit?
Advance.
Yeah, this was in 1992, and when the women's movement really brought to light the occurrence that there are other experiences in the world that are pretty traumatic. They may not be life-threatening, but they still induce those feelings of terror, helplessness, and loss of control, and they are very common. And that's things such as rape, physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. The group at Harvard was really sort of key in sort of bringing these things to light. And if you ever get a chance to read a wonderful book is called Trauma and Recovery. It's by Judith Lewis Herman. And she's just a fantastic writer that was one of the early books about PTSD in women. And then again, but that didn't cover it all as well, because then we had this situation, well, what about children? Children whose early development occurred in very extreme, pervasively, chronically unsafe situations, deprivation or abusive conditions. What about those kids? And in fact, those are interesting. Well, what happened is children actually got really thrown under the bus for a long time because they didn't fit our conceptions of what PTSD and trauma looked like, and they didn't fit the criteria. As a matter of fact, there was a interesting study that was done, I think Bob Kincher did it in the 90s, about looking at the kids who came through the Boston court system. And I think many of those kids came through because it was a physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, but very, very few of them actually met the criteria for PTSD, because that's not how kids do it. So what constitutes trauma? Our broader definition now is witnessing domestic violence or community violence, suffering some kind of direct suffering of abuse of physical, sexual, or psychological, especially occurring within the context of relationship. And this is, I think, what's the thing that's so complicated and so difficult is it's one thing to have your world blown up with you by the bad guys, by your enemy, but when it's done by the people that you love most and trust most, where does that leave you? And then neglect of physical, social, and emotional needs. Neglect is also something that people really, really underestimate, is that even those kids who have been physically abused by their parent, who have that's in the context of a relation, they have a relationship. But when you have no relationship, when you don't get the sense that there's anybody out there who even cares that you exist, that is absolutely, it is probably one of the worst things that you can do to someone. And I think that's, so, and what we find actually is when we look at what are the things that are the worst for people, for kids growing up, and it's neglect. So Nancy.
And so again, this leads to incredible damage to social and interpersonal relationship abilities.
So we talk a lot about big T trauma and little t trauma. So big T trauma is like war, rape, torture, these, clearly awful, terrible things. But there's also something that, and especially Nancy is going to talk a lot about this later on, little T trauma. And that's the stressful events that affect our physiology and neurology, such as bullying, neglect, and I wouldn't put neglect in there. That's me, and exposure to violence. So I actually talk about this slide as the stress trauma continuum, because it is a long range. I mean, it's mediated by a number of other things that we'll talk about as well, but it's all sort of on the same continuum of from little minor stuff that just stresses us out to witnessing something really, truly awful. Okay.
And there's a tipping point perhaps for people where the stress, tips.
And the thing is, and for everybody, the tipping point is different.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I think that's really sort of key as well. And we're going to talk about vulnerability later on.
A tipping point into dysfunction, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we used to think that trauma was rare. This is going back to the studies with PTSD. They were our early studies with soldiers and PTSD. But one of the things that sort of also blew our minds away is that this is something probably a lot of you know about, is the ACEs study, and it's the adverse childhood experience. This was actually done by Kaiser Permanente, I think it was in the 90s, of 17,000 of their HMO members. And this is really, it's a retrospective study, looking back, asking people how many of them experienced 10 different adverse childhood experiences. Now, what was really different about this study, though, and I just want to talk about this for a minute, is that this was not done in a clinic population where people were already coming in because they had a problem and because they were poor or marginalized and they couldn't access services in another way, or they were in jails or they were in homes. These were HMO. They're just everyday people, and so it's actually the most representative group of people that represents the range of the people who live in this country of any of the studies that had done that up to that point. And that was really one of the things that was really important about it. But what we found out, this is a list of some of the things that they listed as ACEs. So violence or abuse, witnessing violence, having a family member who tried to kill themselves, growing up in a household where there were drug problems or mental health problems or parental separation. Wish I could look. So, and what we found was it was really common. Trauma was really common. This is actually a slide of a follow-up thing, but it's still the same. It has the same kind of data, which is that the majority of people have experienced at least one type of ACE. Nearly 1 in 6 reported they experienced 4 or more ACEs. And there is a direct and positive relationship between the number of ACEs that you experience and your chances of chronic health problems, mental illnesses, substance misuse, a variety of bad outcomes leading to early death. And it's really, the evidence was incredibly powerful. Now we're still talking about this and we're still futzing around about this. And people are all still surprised about this. There was some recent study that came out that confirmed this in a different, they were looking at studies in a different way. But again, the more bad things that have happened to you, at some point, your body can't handle it anymore.
And we still do tend to have a division between emotional and physical problems. And this is the, kind of a new paradigm in our thinking of how emotional problems affect our.
We can't really separate the two things out. I mean, for instance, women who are sexually abused as children have tremendous problems with their reproductive systems and their GI systems and a bunch of other stuff that might be related to the trauma that they experienced early. But it's physical problems. They're not, this isn't making stuff up with your head. It's they're having problems with that, aspect of their body and their integration.
Not to ignore the fact that they're also having emotional problems.
Exactly. So, but what about kids? Why are kids so different than everybody else? Why do they not sort of fit into our nice little, checklist again for PTSD? And it's because of the developmental vulnerability. When we think about it, babies are completely helpless. They are absolutely dependent on us for care and to notice when they're hungry, when they're tired, when they're wet, when they're cold. They can't do anything about it. So when you think about that, what's life-threatening to a child is not the same as what's life-threatening to an adult. To a baby who's completely without resources at that point, it's a crisis. It's life-threatening when they're wet and cold and they've been that way. So that's what I think is sort of really important to hold on to, is that we have to think about, again, in the context of development, what are we asking kids to manage, all right? And the other point that will come across, I think, in this thing as well, is that when brains are growing, I mean, that children's brains grow, I think the brain size increases 4 times in the last trimester of pregnancy and the first 18 months of life. And at this point, if they're experiencing some kind of traumatic experiences, and that's going to alter the way their brains grow. And that's going to set them up for problems later on.
We know it can rewire brain chemistry, physiology, and have a permanent impact.
We're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to just give you a quick run through the neurobiology response of stress. Now, remember, I'll go back to I love that little guy. Let me show you the zebra again. Yeah, okay, so this is an example of what happens. I don't know, I just thought this was really cute. And it's a photo from, so that's great. So now, let's remember, and it was something, I heard this actually, I was listening to the radio, and they were talking about the COVID-19 crisis, and they had a psychologist on who pointed out, and I want to say the same thing, stress and anxiety is not a bad thing. It's our built-in survival mechanisms. It's our body's alarm system. It's the way it tells us something. I think about the tigers are coming, something bad is happening. You got to get ready to handle this, right? And it's a really key and incredibly adaptive response that has gotten us through tigers and bears and lions and whatever. And the process that this happens is it's the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal circuit is the one that sets up the body's alarm system. Now, I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but this is sort of the circuit. The brain sees something, it sets up, it sends messages out to the hypothalamus and different parts of the brain. They release chemicals, and that goes through this whole sort of cycle that goes through the pituitary gland and down into the adrenal gland, which is on top of your kidneys, and goes back. But the base, and this is a lot about hormones actually, which is pretty interesting. So what these hormones do is when the cycle gets set up, is they switch on systems that are needed to respond to threat. That's your sympathetic nervous system. That's your fight or flight system. Okay, your breathing increases, your respirations increases, your heart rate increases. There's energy there's sugar that's released for glucose, so you can move quickly and you're ready to go. It's like the ready position, from baseball. If you ever, my son, I had to watch a lot of baseball. My son growing up, and they always talked about the ready position, being ready to handle anything. This is your body being ready to handle stuff. It switches, but also it switches off the systems that are not essential to crisis response. That's your parasympathetic system, and that's often called the rest and digest. That's your digestive system. That's your reproductive hormones. That's your growth hormones. It's also higher levels of your brain, and that's really important. So at the time when you're ready, when you're trying to deal with tigers, you don't need to know, is it really a puma or is it a mountain lion, and how do I make those distinctions? That's not important. What's important is get me out of here really fast. Okay, that's good. That gets you out of there really fast. But we'll talk about the problems when you shut off your higher level thinking. okay? Once the danger is passed, there's a feedback loop that shuts off the production of the hormones that are keeping your sympathetic nervous system going and turns back on the system, the parasympathetic nervous system. And one of the really interesting things is I've done this work on reset, you know, when they keep telling you to take a deep breath all the time, the reason they tell you to take a deep breath, the function of taking a deep breath is it turns on your parasympathetic nervous system, which I just think is really interesting, really cool. I tell it to kids all the time when they look at me when I say take a deep breath. So, but here's the question: what happens if the loop doesn't ever shut down? What happens if we aren't able to sort of complete the cycle of getting activated and then getting calmed down after the danger is passed? Well, this is a situation that a lot of children are in. When the danger never passes, you know, what happens is that feedback loop gets stronger and stronger and stronger. It's like anything else. You learn, practice makes perfect. You know, you get to be really good at responding to danger. And then what happens is it ends up setting up a very sensitive stress response. That's what we call hypervigilance. And that's always being in the ready position, always looking around, waiting, you know, what's going to happen next? Am I ready to handle this? That can be very adaptive when there are tigers around. But when we're talking about being in school and having the kid next to you, like, crunch his pencil, you know, they make a funny sound with a pencil that's very irritating. That's not really helpful. Okay. So what's the impact of this sort of this hypervigilance, this sort of being stuck in threat alert? You know, your attentional system, first of all, is geared to be on the lookout for danger. That's triggers, okay? Your arousal set points are fixed. They're extremely sensitive to anything that could come by. And that's the kids who in my office go, someone walks by and they'll go, what's that? Or they see something out, you know, a bird flying by. They're constantly paying attention to everything and reacting very, very quickly. And then it distorts the perceptions of people and events. If you think about it, if you're always looking for tigers and something strange comes by, unexplained or ambiguous comes into your situation, you're going to have a negative bias for that. Your bias is going to be, it's dangerous, and you're going to respond accordingly.
Along with the mistrust that you were talking about before, the lack of ability to sort of trust other people.
Right. It drastically limits, this is getting back to the higher level thinking, drastically limits capacity for flexible thinking and creative problem solving. When you're trying to run away from tigers, you're not interested. I mean, it's like, it's just not, it's not what's really important. It's like, but the fact is, if you're responding when the teacher asks you a math problem and you don't know it, you know, it may not, your first reaction is not going to be, well, let's see, she was nice to me yesterday, so maybe she'll be nice to me today. Maybe I should ask her for some help. That's not the first thing that's going to go through your mind. It's like, she hates me because she knows I hate math. And then this is something I think is also really important. And there's something actually, I think people are a little more tuned into with the autism community, because the sensory issues are so common, that being constantly on the alert creates conditions of physical discomfort. You know, your stomach, your stomach is always a mess. You got headaches, you get, you know, you're tense, your body's really tense. You can't ever really relax. And that's physically uncomfortable, which is also very distracting. So I'm going to just really go through this really quickly, but behavioral presentation in the class of a kid who might be traumatized. They're going to have attention and executive function problems. Remember, they're looking for danger. They're not looking for the math problem. And it can look like ADHD, but it's not. They have diminished language competency. Again, language is a higher level brain function. And so, you know, think about it for yourself when you get upset or mad or angry. It's like you can't find the words. That's happening also with these kids who are really always in hypervigilance. Your behavior, you have a lot of behavioral dysregulation. You're constantly reacting. You're overly reactive, okay, or underly reactive. So you might just sort of sit there like a lump or space out, or you might like blow up. There's a very high rate of anxiety, depression, and injurious behaviors. These kids have learning issues. Not surprising. They're having a really hard time. They're not available really for learning because they're always looking for danger. It affects also their social skills, because again, they're looking for danger. They're not looking for like nuances. Well, she bumped into me, but it was because a kid pushed her behind, or they didn't really mean it, or, you know, but she was just being silly, or whatever. That's just not going to happen. So these kids often alienate other people. And then as kids get older, substance abuse is a really common problem because they need to self-medicate because they want to just relax and they can't. So who's most vulnerable to trauma? any marginalized or powerless population. So that means women, children, ethnic minorities, impoverished individuals, and people with disabilities or differences. Okay, and all of these groups have been found to have a more have both more traumatic events happen to them and be more sensitive, more reactive to those traumatic events. Okay, and so, all right. So the problem is autism and its vulnerability to stress and trauma. So Nancy, you're gonna.
Yeah, thank you, Steph. I'm gonna talk a little bit about how the studies that are making it very clear that people on the autism spectrum are more vulnerable to stress and trauma. And so I'm just going to go through and cite some studies that really struck me once I dive into the research. There's a lot of science, research out there that's showing this. I shouldn't say a lot, a handful of studies, but they're pretty significant. So we know that people with autism have a higher risk of adverse childhood experiences, those ACEs. A diagnosis of autism is significantly associated with a higher probability of 1 or more ACEs. The number of children with autism who were exposed to 4 or more ACEs was twice as high as neurotypicals. I thought this was an interesting population study. And again, when we say population study, it means that they're surveying the entire population. As Steph said earlier, it's not just who walks into a clinic or who's available on a college campus. It's really a population study of all kind of a representative sample of all people. So this was Virginia, 1992 to 1998. 1 in 5 autistic children, 1 in 3 with autism and intellectual disability were reported to be maltreated, even after adjusting for factors such as low family income, limited parental education. Children with autism were 3 times as likely as their neurotypical peers to experience maltreatment. And, you know, unfortunately, this study sort of shows that it's not being taken seriously enough in my read of it. In Tennessee, the researchers analyzed data from an autism monitoring site, more than 24,000 children. Having autism more than doubles a child's chance of referral to Child Protective Services. 17% of the 387 autistic children had been the subject of calls, compared with 7% of neurotypicals. Despite the higher number of reports, child protection professionals investigated the caregivers of only 62% of the autistic children, compared with 92% of the typical children. And this is what I find alarming. I think it goes back to my initial case, right? That when we see a child with autism, we often tend to, if we will, blame the autism for any unusual behaviors or things that might be taken as stress or PTSD in a neurotypical child. And we're not looking carefully enough for autism. I'm sorry, we're not looking carefully enough for trauma in these kids. We know that children with ASD are bullied more than their peers, 3 to 4 times as often. 40 to 90% of children are bullied, up to 90%. And Dr. Kearns is one of these researchers who's been doing this, and I just thought this was really interesting to think about. She's done a lot of speaking to people with autism about their traumatic experiences. And so, of course, she's been hearing the horrendous things, you know, sexual, emotional abuse, bullying. But she also talks about these broader concepts, what it's like to go around your whole life in a world where you have 50% less input than everybody else. And I think 50% less input, but also maybe distorted input. You're not reading the social situations as accurately as you might, or feeling constantly overwhelmed because of sensory experiences and feeling marginalized in society because you're someone with differences. I think we can't underestimate the you know, the difficulty of going around the world feeling different and marginalized.
You know, it's interesting. I was thinking of, this is something, Nancy, when one of the conferences we did, when we had there was the experience of, there was a gentleman who asked, a very, very, very excellent, very bright guy, and he had a lot of insight, and he, you know, talked about himself as a person with autism, and he had a lot of really important things to say, and I was very impressed with him. And then I noticed out in the conference area, he was acting in a way that was socially inappropriate. And we would have just, you know, the kind of thing that you just sort of write off. You just would write, you know, if I had seen him first, you know, doing that, it was just so striking that, you know, the immediate reaction is when people are being so don't fit in socially, you kind of just write them off. But he was also really, I mean, he had a lot of good things to say. And it was just so, you know, striking that even someone who, you know, that knows this happens, is that how quickly we do that. We just don't discount people if they don't act the way we think they should act.
Yeah. And that leads into this point. This slide was introduced because after one of our talks, one of an acquaintance with very intelligent woman with autism talked about, you know, making sure we weren't blaming the victim, that we were not saying, you know, people with autism are you know, responsible for their behaviors, and if they would just get their act together, they wouldn't have these traumatic experiences. And I really just feel it's important to stress that, you know, we see this as the culture's intolerance of diversity. And I, you know, as I thought about this point and talked to her about it, I realized, I feel like we've made progress in some areas. We don't blame victims of rape for being raped quite as much as we used to, not to say it doesn't happen, but it's not as socially acceptable to blame a woman for being raped because of what she was wearing or the way she acted. But I feel like we've made a lot less progress accepting neurodiversity. So those neurodiverse individuals, when they act in ways we don't expect or don't understand, do we tolerate that? Do we truly value neurodiversity in our work, our schools, our community? And I feel like going into schools, I see this all the time. You know, a school will have all kinds of no bullying programs around, but they also don't really make an effort to help the child with autism have friends at recess. You know, they'll make sure that they can get by in the math class, but they may not actually be looking at helping this kid actually be part of the social fabric. And we will come back to that. But more often than not, more often than not, often I see these, you know, people, the kid with autism doesn't have friends, wanders around recess alone, and nobody really seems to think that that's a problem that needs immediate fixing. So again, all these studies just point out that we know that autism increases the risk of trauma, and you know, bullying from peers, parents who don't understand their child, negating messages from teachers, society, even psychologists, and they sometimes are subject to harsh discipline. So I just want to run through a few examples. When I started thinking about this is just popping up all over in some of the recent cases I've had. I had a 5th grader who was in a special ed school for children with learning disabilities, really well behaved, earnest guy, really wanted to do well, hardworking, intelligent. But when he's stressed, he sort of engages in some very overt stereotype behaviors to self-soothe. You know, he tends to flap his fingers in front of his face. And the teachers really couldn't tolerate that in the classroom, and they developed a behavior plan to try to extinguish that if he got 2 warnings and then he would miss recess. Unfortunately, you can imagine this poor kid who wants to do well is being punished for his self-soothing. So he gets further stressed and he does more self-soothing. It got to the point, you know, talk about, you know, smart adaptations. This kid decided, I think consciously or not, that he would just quickly get his 2 warnings and miss recess out of the way first thing in the morning, so that he didn't have to stress about it the rest of the day. So poor kid, he just, you know, he went in every day knowing he was going to miss recess, but the whole situation made school a more stressful experience for him. And unfortunately, the teachers, again, sort of view this, oh, he's being more autistic, not he's being more stressed. And he got soon counseled out of that school based the teachers felt they couldn't handle him, even though academically he was a good fit there. And the parents were very frustrated, as you know, as was I, with the school not being able to be more flexible around finding other ways for this kid to self-soothe. A parent recently confessed to me that, you know, kind of had a lot of guilt about how she used to parent her child really before she realized that he was autistic, how she got angry at all of his perseverative behaviors and interests, and she tried to extinguish the behaviors by ignoring them, but often lost patience with him. So, you know, this is a smart, well-meaning, loving parent, and I think even parents who mean the best sometimes don't quite know how to handle these kids and can induce trauma by
challenging. It's challenging. Not to say, you know, this is sort of like preaching to the choir here, but you know, we have sort of a general idea of how parenting is supposed to go and how kids are supposed to go, and when it doesn't work, what do we do? You know,
and I think some parenting advice really doesn't work for these kids.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And then, of course, you know, some kids have trauma based on the lovely behavior of their peers. I had this 16-year-old kid who was really smart in a public school, but he was so totally naive, and the other kids found it very fun to set him up for failure. So, you know, go ask that girl out. She likes you. Really? Okay. And they told him that vaping was okay at school and he could vape in the front lobby. They gave him a vape and he got in trouble and was suspended. So he ended up at a school that was less academically appropriate for him because he was a very, very bright kid. But again, nobody seemed to, you know, they were working hard on his reading and his math, but they weren't necessarily addressing these issues of, you know, the larger social environment, what was going on between the other kids. This was subtle enough that the teachers didn't see it as bullying per se. It's important to recognize that, you know, the situation, the traumatic experiences are worse for adults who grew up before we understood what autism really was all about. And people, I'm on the board at AANE, and I know some adults with autism who grown up with all kinds of traumatic experiences before we had a real understanding of treatment of either trauma or autism. I thought this was really interesting too. You know, we talk about the neurological difference between autism and trauma, that one is inherited, you know, you're born with autism, and trauma is presumably acquired. But we know how flexible the brain is, and that as Stephanie was alluding to earlier, the things, you know, what wires together fires together. The more you do something, the more easily it is that you evoke that behavior. Simply, you know, if you practice the piano a lot, you get better at the piano, you muscle memory, and your body remembers trauma in a somewhat the same way.
Yeah.
So that if we have, you know, trauma disorders, and ASD may be causing kind of a similar disruption in brain architecture and function, even though one's inherited and one's acquired. Again, this is in Jason Fogler's excellent book on trauma and autism. Steph?
Okay. So how do we go about treating trauma? We're going to sort of break this up a little bit. I'm going to talk just in general about treating trauma, and then we're going to go into the issues about doing that with people who are on the spectrum.
Oh, you know, sorry, I wanted to say this. I feel like now we know that many individuals with autism have experienced trauma. What can we learn from the field of therapy? Because I feel like in talking to Steph and talking, you know, the people at MAC, the treatment for trauma has been really well researched, pretty well established, even if it's not implemented well. And yeah, the first principle is creating safety and trust.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, and I think that just to sort of from a big picture standpoint, we talk a lot about resiliency, and people talk, well, let's have resilient kids and stuff like that. There was an interesting, I did my research, my dissertation on intergenerational transmission of maltreatment, and a group of parents who are trying to do something different. And so I did a lot of research on this, and one of the things that I found was really pretty upsetting. I think it was Egeland from Minnesota, that they looked at, again, this is sort of as you pile up the trauma, if you pile up the bad experience, if you pile up the bad luck, at some point people just can't make it through. But there are people who do, and some people can make it through and some people can't. What's the difference? And so I'm careful when I use the word resilient, because I think at some point nobody can get through, but you're always going to have scars. But I think what makes the difference in making a better outcome is both psychosocial support, which means the caregiver's response to the traumatized individual, but also the fit with the community. And so the example of that would be, you know, the terrible situations in some of the countries, I think it was Syria, that when the terrorists try to take over a community, they rape the women. And in those cultures, women are completely, in some of the Middle Eastern cultures, that means the woman is completely spoiled and she will never be able to be part of the community again. Versus if something terrible happened in one of our community, so if someone had a car accident and the parents were, a parent was killed and a child was killed, the entire community will come together to try to help that person, because there's a way that they can sort of fit. There's a cultural sense about that. There's a meaning that we share about community and helping each other out that didn't happen in a different kind of community or on a different kind of issue. So that's one thing. And the second is the individual sense of mastery, a sense of their ability to be able to be effective in the world. Now, that was actually, it was interesting that was actually my research. What I found out was that the people who did best were the ones who were important, who felt important to someone and good at something. What I didn't get at the time was the importance of the self-regulation piece of this. And I think the National Child Traumatic Stress Network did a better job than I did. And when they looked at it more completely, and what they came up with was this ARC model. And that's building secure attachments between the child and the caregivers, enhancing self-regulatory capacities. That's the capacity sort of to be able to calm yourself down and keep yourself in the right kind of frame of mind, emotionally and behaviorally, to be able to do what you need to do. And then increasing competencies against multiple domains. Now, they have a particular model that's based on a variety of things, but these are, I think, the three pieces that are like, they're the three legs of the chair for any kind of, basically, most of our approaches to treating trauma. So, in the school setting, which I think is really key as well. The keys to developing effective strategies would be, first of all, you need to know the child's learning profile. What are the issues for this kid? Is it more attention? Is it more learning? Is it social challenges? Is it all those three things together? Okay. What's the sensitivity to the child's temperamental style? Okay. So is this a fight, flight, or freeze kid? And we talked about, your reactions to to threat alert. The three reactions that we have basically are fight, which is, fighting back, the kid who tries to take off in one way or another, or the kid who just freezes like a deer freezes when they see something coming and they're trying not to be seen. Okay, that's really important to know, because a lot of times teachers will misinterpret behavior. Like freeze behavior is they think they're non-compliant and they won't get along. The kid can't do anything. They're completely frozen at that point. They're just trying to get through the math class, which is really threatening to them. Knowing that the direct approach to stress, like don't worry, really isn't going to help. However, validations and modifications can make a big difference. Like, I know math is really tough for you, isn't it? I can tell. Tell you what, let's just do a couple problems at a time, and then we'll go take a little break, and then we'll see what we need to do. That can make a huge difference. That can sort of reduce the level of stress. This is where the kid can actually start thinking again. All right. This, I think, is the point, that I sort of probably should start off with, which is when kids go into survival mode, they don't have access to their higher level skills, including and especially language. So you can't ask them to do things like, let's talk about the problem, or tell me what you need to do. You need to help when they're in that kind of mode. You need to identify that mode and help them figure out how to take care of themselves around that and self-advocate. So one of the things that when behaviorists come in for an anxious kid, unfortunately, they're really focused again on behaviors, which happen or they don't happen. And that's not what they should be focused on. The focus should be on what is the triggering focus for anxiety, and what are the goals, what are the coping skills we want the kid to use. So what we want to do is we want to build a behavioral program that rewards and reinforces the use of coping strategies, not whether or not they're going to freak out when the math test gets brought. And then again, teaching skills that are lacking. So it's not just teaching them coping skills, it's helping them with their math. It's not just teaching them how to, take a break. It's on teaching them how to actually decode language, decode words for reading. We can't forget about the other pieces of this when we're working on helping kids who are feeling stressed and traumatized. Now, ecological fit is actually, Mike, this is something that was identified in the book, the chapter that Mike Gregory and his associates at MAC wrote for the book that Nancy was talking about earlier. And this is again from Mary Harvey. And what she's talking about is again, the quality and helpfulness of the relationship that exists between the individual and his or her social context. And again, this concept of ecological fit is really, really, really critical, especially for kids who are on the spectrum, who don't have the other, their social skills aren't great. Their ability to sort of plan ahead isn't fantastic either. And they tend to get involved in behaviors that are off-putting to other people. So we need to find a way that makes them help to fit into their environment, all right? And I think Nancy's going to talk about this a little bit later on, but still, that ecological fit, it's really, again, it's finding where a kid fits into their community and helping them find a place where they can feel good about themselves because they're offering something valuable to people. And that can be a lot of different things,
A sense of belonging and yeah, a sense of being community.
So, and this again is a quote that I love from Mary Harvey, that again, and Nancy's going to talk about this later on, is that even highly effective interventions they must be embedded and familiar within the context of the larger community. All right. So even if a kid may need to do their behaviors to help them stress out, if they're the person that you can absolutely count on because they deliver the mail accurately and on time and say hi to you every single day, that's important, so you can they can fit, if they have a place that works for them. And that's what we need. We can't just teach skills and then not have that be part of the larger way of fitting into the community. All right. So I talked about a lot of this.
I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit. Yeah. It's the situation that's all too familiar for any of us who work with schools. A lot of school environments do a good job offering special ed services. They'll have speech once a week or social skills training, but the larger context, the school, the teacher and the other children don't get training on acceptance of neurodiversity and the value of it. So the child becomes isolated. They don't have anybody they don't have friends to practice those social skills with. So the once a week pull-out session of social skills isn't going to go very far if they don't actually have any friends to, enjoy or have positive social experiences.
And I think the thing, just briefly, I think of the kid that I had is, to find a place that fits and is valued in that community. So the kid who's really good at video games, that's great. Let's use that. If that's how a kid fits in, it can be of value to his peer group, because, the kid who knows how to do the servers and stuff like that for even Minecraft, that's cool. And that's a way that he could have some value and importance and feel meaningful and as a cog in that greater community.
I had another good example. I think I bring one up later at the end, but another one that was a really nice creative thing was one of my high school kids with autism was in a public school and needed a fair amount of support, but he was the tech guy and he put up signs around the school offering tech support. And so when the teachers couldn't get their smart board to work, which many of the trouble with, they'd call him and he'd come up, and I asked him once, what did you do? He said, I turned it off and turned it on again, which I just loved. But he really felt like he was the tech guru for the school, which is just a lovely creative way of making him feel important and part of the community. And AANE recently did a survey of almost 300 adults with ASD and found that employment is a huge issue. And not surprisingly, adults with ASD really often need support in some of the soft skills. It's the how do I negotiate around what I'm being asked to do? How do I talk to my boss about things that work or don't work for me? How do I ask for a new role, advancement? How do I interact with my coworkers? How do I join the group going out for beer in the evening? And, a not surprising finding was that employers really need support too. And many, high functioning individuals get hired for jobs that suit their skills, but there's no commitment to neurodiversity. I think a lot of high functioning, intelligent individuals try to mask when they go to a job site. So they don't want to be telling people that they have autism because of the stigma, but then they miss out. And again, most employers aren't terribly good at creating a culture that's committed to neurodiversity. And too often these jobs don't last. They don't fit, mostly because, again, these soft skills and fitting in. So the ecological fit, the fit of the community is vital.
So we just want to plug also some of the work that's been done with Mass Advocates for Children. And I also have to say, you guys, I was in a conference a couple years ago, and there were some people from all over the country, and I happened to be talking to some people from San Francisco. They were asking about trauma stuff, and did I know anything about, any kind of programs that would be school-wide? I said, well, have you heard of the Purple Book? And they were really excited to get that kind of stuff. And when I go around and talk to people, everybody knows, people know about it. And if they don't know about it, they want it. So the work that Mac has done in terms of both with the TLPI group of just really helping us sort of understand what's out there, and the work of trying to figure out what we can do to help, I think is really important. And I think the other thing is that a recent, I think, wonderful approach here is that, so we talk about having trauma-sensitive schools, which really means having the whole school be involved. And it isn't just the classroom or the teacher or this particular kid. It's the whole school has to be more sensitive to these kinds of issues, because we want the kid to travel in the environment and the community of the school. That has to happen. So this is a great video. I think it's only 15 minutes. It's not very long. And it talks about the school's journey to trauma sensitivity. And this is the George Elementary School in Brockton. And this is really, really a fascinating, I really thought this was a great piece to sort of show people how this could happen. This actually happened, I think it was a principal who decided she wanted to do something for her school. In Brockton, some of the schools are pretty rough. I know they were in receivership in about 15 or 20 years ago. But things they've really worked since then to sort of try to help make their schools more available and accepting of their kids. And this is a principal who just sent out something to everybody in her school staff and said, look, anybody who wants to talk about making our schools more trauma sensitive, please show up after school in this area. And she got a huge response from not just teachers, but custodians and the ladies who work in the lunchroom and a variety of people in the staff. And they as a group started really sort of talking through some of these issues. And it sounded like it was kind of tough conversations, but really important conversations that they all could work at. It wasn't just a top-down kind of say, we're going to do this X, Y, and Z. It's like, how can we, in our environment, knowing our kids and our situation, what can we do to make this work better for our kids? So I want to, there were a couple of just really wonderful scenes of, kids walking in, and they had, as they walked into the classroom, I think it was a first or second grade class, and there was a little bar graph that had, different colors about how you were feeling when you were walking in that day. And you could touch that, and then the teacher would give you a hug or not give you a hug, if you're feeling good or you weren't feeling good, or, things are really bad. So, I mean, just that kind of stuff, I think, we talk about from the individual basis to the larger basis. We will talk about treatment of individuals, but it's the community that makes the difference. And I think that's something that we feel really strongly about. So.
And moving on to the next section, taking all of that wonderful knowledge and experience about creating trauma-sensitive environments, how do we apply that to the population of kids with autism? Again, I think we feel it's really important because these kids, the same principles on trauma sensitivity apply to people with autism, perhaps even more strongly than the neurotypical population.
Remembering, of course, yeah, because, well, yeah. We'll go into it.
The first principle is safety and emotional regulation. As Stephanie pointed out, nobody can learn, nobody can pay attention or behave well if they're distressed, stressed, physically uncomfortable, distracted, hyper-aroused. And so people with autism, we know, benefit from that kind of consistency, reliability, and predictability. What I think sometimes gets lost when you're talking about the population of people with autism is that people don't necessarily value the relationships, that they tend to minimize the idea that these kids need relationships. And, I feel so strongly about this. Even the most disconnected, socially challenged kids really depend on a parent or caregiver. The ones who I have seen in my office who don't know how to connect with anyone, they do need relationships. It's really important that we not discount the importance of relationships for people with autism.
I think it's an interesting contrast with the kids with trauma, because they don't have relationships either, but it's because they can't trust, because of the trust issue. I think so. And so they're coming through. So what happens is that they need to know that a person is reliable and trustworthy, because they need to learn how to trust them, and they can't do that unless they have the evidence. I think for people on the spectrum, it's a little bit different, but it's learning that that's how you make. I want to be connected. How can I be connected? How can I be connected in a way that's comfortable for me?
Yeah. And again, going back, everybody needs those relationships. Everybody needs that kind of connection to feel safe and secure in an environment. And, for the 7-year-old that we started this talk about, I really was suggesting with the school that they let him connect with one person at a time, that there needs to be a slow, gradual building of trust. But that was a very important goal. It had to happen before he would be able to progress and be available for any kind of relationship or learning. Therapy was developed for neurotypicals.
And adult neurotypicals.
What's that?
Not only neurotypicals, but adult neurotypicals.
Adult, intelligent, highly verbal neurotypical.
Right.
And the profile of autism can make therapy harder, because people with autism do have a different way of processing their emotional experience. They don't fall into the standard therapeutic framework, and they tend to have less robust support networks. Again, we expect people to go into therapy and make eye contact, trust the therapist, open up, talk about your fears, and express all those feelings in language, all of which can be more challenging for some of our kids with autism. And I think, again, where we start this, we're really concerned that the mental health field is siloed. I see we go into schools and there are behavior programs that have an emphasis on, managing behaviors without understanding the emotional experience, what the communication of that behavior is. Some programs still rely on restraints and seclusion, which we know if anyone has sensory issues or has experienced any kind of trauma or violence, this is really triggering. So then you can be in a behavior program, or it's rarely or you can be in a therapeutic program. And in a therapeutic program, they often don't know how to handle individuals with autism who have unusual behaviors, who also have unusual ways of expressing themselves, who may have quirky language and an odd way of thinking and communicating.
And so for instance, one of the most effective ways, and I used to be an adolescent and family therapist, so I found that, individual therapy was not particularly effective with teenagers. It was a little too intense, a little too freaked out, but groups are really good for teenagers. But that's not necessarily true with kids on the spectrum, because that's too many people to process at once. I mean, it's just too much information at once, so.
So we really need to do a lot more work on modifying traditional therapies. And I'm going to mention some of the things I've come across in my research. I talked to Eva Mendez, who's a local therapist, and she said, I have to modify therapy for anyone on the autism spectrum, really, no matter how intelligent. She said, you can't just talk and wait for them to develop insight. I'm much more clear and direct and do a lot of psychoeducation. So again, mild modifications, but important ones. Again, people with autism, some subsection of the autism population has this vulnerable physiology. They're more likely to get stressed. They get more easily stressed, and they the stress response Stephanie was talking about before, that feedback loop doesn't kick in as easily. So the stress doesn't diminish, and the stress response can be longer lasting, which means that some of the, anxiety treatment, one of the common treatments for anxiety is exposure response prevention, where we expose an individual to whatever they're anxious about or afraid of under safe conditions and wait for that stress response to wane. People feel it's safe. I can tolerate this. It builds tolerance. It builds resilience. But one study that I found, children with autism who have this hypersensitive physiology, the stress response doesn't wane. or if it does, it occurs at a very glacial pace. And this was borne out for me by one young teen that I had who was going to therapy and had a lot of kind of phobias and panic. And she said, I don't know why autistic, but reasonably intelligent and verbal. I don't know why my therapist wants me to be in this uncomfortable stuff. She just keeps making me uncomfortable. I don't like it at all. So this exposure response prevention really wasn't working for her.
It was interesting. This is also something we heard about when we've done this before with adults who said, who just really talked about how just very traumatic it was for them to be going through having these kinds of therapies that didn't understand them at all and what was bothersome to them.
So again, this could be modified. A skilled therapist who understands autism could modify to make the exposure even more slow-paced and moderate. As I mentioned before, the 5th grader who had a behavior plan to reduce the self-soothing behaviors, it's a really important point that when you have an emotionally driven behavior, a behavior plan per se usually doesn't help. When you've got an anxiety response, it's such a strong, powerful, it's a survival feeling. It's an adaptation to help us survive. And so the idea of thinking into the future and saying, oh, but if I don't do this self-soothing, then I'll get time on my iPad. That isn't really usually capable of happening. And I think it's one of the real issues we have with behavior plans that are not taking into account the emotion behind certain behaviors.
The other problem with behavior plans, and this is, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna read that last part. When what you're being asked to do is just terrifying. Getting a sticker, getting a reward, time on your iPad just doesn't compete with the need to reduce that terror and reduce that anxiety.
I have a funny story about this, actually. I had a dog who was extremely, unbelievably anxious, and I was trying to train her, and so every time I would try to bring her to a place that it didn't work, and so I was bringing her to this the New England Dog Training Center, I think it was, and they said, well, just give her better treats, and so we went from dried treats to cheese to hot dogs to steak. I think I was giving her raw steak, nothing, because you know what? It didn't matter how good the snacks were. She was just too scared to go in that big place that was so noisy. Okay, got it.
And then I to highlight the siloed field, I had a very distressing case recently of a 13-year-old girl who had autism and some language issues and a lot of anxiety, just a really lot of anxiety. And she developed kind of OCD behaviors. So she did some really inappropriate compulsive behaviors when she would get stressed. And she was flashing, and she had a couple things where she took off her clothes and ran into the street that was enough to get her hospitalized. So there may be some, sexualized trauma back there that we don't know about that she hasn't been able to explain or express. So she was placed in a therapeutic hospital setting, and after a few weeks there, they said, well, we're not helping her. She can't access our therapeutic groups. Her language wasn't good enough, or the language and the content of the therapeutic group with a bunch of neurotypical teens, she wasn't accessing it. So the therapeutic group said, she really needs a behavioral program. So great, so we take her out of the therapeutic hospital setting and she goes to a behavior program in her public school. And that includes seclusion in a timeout room when she acts out. And pretty soon, I don't think she lasted 3 days at the school before she was really stressing, engaging in more of these compulsive behaviors, because again, when you're stressed, you tend to do whatever self-soothes, and sometimes those are inappropriate behaviors. But she really, it just was so frustrating for all of us that we couldn't find a place for her that could address both the autistic tendencies, the language, and the anxiety. Another study I found that children with autism have a lot of trouble with classic CBT. They don't benefit. They have trouble generalizing lessons. They don't maintain gains. And the thinking is that children with autism need therapy for longer, more follow-up than typical peers. And
let me just talk a little bit about cognitive behavioral therapy. Is that's what CBT is, and then some of the theory behind cognitive behavioral therapy is that our thinking is what's sort of getting in the way of our responding in ways that are more effective and more successful, really. And so a lot of the work in CBT is looking at our thought process and sort of challenging like all or nothing thinking, black and white thinking, a lot of stuff that kind of really is a lot more complicated for kids on the spectrum than it might be for other kids.
Yeah.
And the capacity, it requires the capacity to be an observer of your behavior. Again, not a strength for for most kids developmentally, but particularly difficult for kids who are contending with these sort of social and the profile of someone on the spectrum.
So this is something that's in the works, a modified version of CBT being developed and studied by a team at U California, and where they're just providing extra coaching and support to teach appropriate social skills before engaging, in the challenge of feared situations, and working with schools to make sure these children have peers who help them through. So I don't know much about that beyond this, but it is encouraging that, some of these therapies are being developed. As Stephanie said, dialectic behavior therapy is a version of CBT that is a little bit more focused, I should say quite a bit more focused on emotional regulation, originally developed for people with borderline personality disorder who have real serious emotional swings. But this is also, it has a lot of complex language and concepts and can be inaccessible. So one participant in one of our webinars about this told me, I went to a DBT group, but I didn't understand anything they said.
So the four tenets of DBT are emotional regulation, distress tolerance, mindfulness, and interpersonal effectiveness. Great goals.
But they're
those
big
are so
language.
abstract.
Yeah.
It's just really, really difficult and it's the treatment du jour these days. But from a developmental perspective, most kids don't really understand it, and it isn't until late adolescence that, again, the cognitive, the executive function, the capacity to be an observer of your own behavior, that kind of stuff kicks in for kids. This is neurotypical kids.
Yeah.
The DBT stuff just goes right over people's heads. So Julie Brown is someone who worked at the Justice Resource Institute for many, many years, and she worked with cognitively challenged individuals. And she tried lots of different things to try to help this group of people sort of function. And this is also a group of people who have difficulty with abstraction. They don't follow, the language issues are often, the higher level abstract figurative language is often difficult for them. And they have a lot of problems with impulse control and emotional regulation. And so what she did was she really worked on a system of making the DBT concepts less abstract and less language heavy, and they can really be used. They're actually nice. They're very clear. I think they'd be great to use for kids. I think they'd be great to use for people with ASD because they're very, very. It's very, very clear, more clear cut. This is when you do this. This is when you can do this. And in the language is like get a clear picture. Clear the decks. I mean, it's really nice work. And she's doing a lot of, she's actually, her work has really been translated in a number of different, across the world really, in a number of different countries in there. And she's doing a lot of work of training right now in the Massachusetts area in particular. And I think this is something that we really need to look for because this would be a really great place to start in terms of looking at how to modify and make this more sort of user-friendly.
And this book is in the resources
right
at the end.
And you can find her online too.
Yeah, but the specific book that we're referring to here. Anyway, I think we're going to wrap it up here with just again saying we need to use everything we know. We know a lot about trauma. We know a lot about autism. We need to bring those knowledges together and work more effectively together in a non-siloed way to create treatment plans that work for individuals. That, a lot of individuals with autism require trauma-informed treatment, and often they're not getting it, either due to, I think in the school districts, it's because there's been this heavy emphasis on behavioral approaches. behavioral approaches have their role. They are important for a lot of kids, but when they ignore the emotional experience of an individual, they can be challenging and it can be actually harmful. And we know that many individuals with trauma histories benefit from consistency and structure. You know, I just have to end with a little plug that we really need to try to appreciate neurodiversity. I gave the example earlier of the kid in high school who was being the tech guru. I had another good example from, you know, from real life, a public school. This kid with autism loves sports facts. He knows every fact there is to know about every sports team. He can't play sports worth a darn, but he's a sports, you know, encyclopedia. So they made him the announcer of the high school football team, which I just thought was brilliant and so lovely. And he was so proud of himself. I've got another guy who loves weather, and it used to be a struggle to get him to talk about anything but weather. And now he's studying meteorology in college, and I've got fingers crossed for him that he can go on and become an excellent meteorologist. And then Sternberg, who
I actually have another one. So
I have to finish my sentence, Steph.
Okay,
Fortunately,
sorry.
she's focusing on climate change, which we all need. So we know that these kind of special interests, they're helpful for individuals with autism because they are self-soothing in a way. They provide pleasure. They can lead to productive vocations, and again, provide the impetus to transcend challenges. And sorry, I'm going to end with a Temple Grandin joke. She said this at the AAN. That much of the world's great progress has been made by people who think outside the box. Whether we put them on the spectrum or not, they're outside the box thinkers, and that diversity is hugely valuable. These are some of the scientific studies that I cited, and then we have some of the resources there. So thank you all. We'll take questions in the time we have left. It's 11:30. Awesome, Steph.
Hey, we did it.
Great,
We ended somewhat on time.
So there were a number of people that wrote questions into the chat. People can add to it, and Susan and Mike, if you all unmute yourselves as well, perhaps you can chime in. But I do want to say just thank you so much. People are certainly putting that information right now in the chat too. This was an incredibly valuable and just important presentation, and we're just so thrilled that you all were able to join us. So there are a number of questions.
Oh, I see the chat room. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to look a little bit back in the beginnings. One of the questions, it was when I think you were talking about, well, actually, I should go back one other quick thing for the references. Mike Gregory did provide a link to the grid that you mentioned, the Coventry grid.
I should have done that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, yeah. So Mike,
I sort of feel like it's only really of interest to us diagnosticians, nerdly diagnosticians, but thank you.
Yep. But early on, I think when you were looking at various aspects of violence, Joan Winaley had asked about thoughts on sibling violence, and I don't know if that's something that you all have had some, exposure to or whatever. I mean, information about.
I don't know, Nancy, you may know more, but I know that that's a huge issue with a lot of the kids that I work with. In both, actually, with both autism and trauma and the mix as well. And I think it speaks to the need to our in-home services programs really need to be beefed up. And right now, I have a lot of trauma kids that I would love to get in-home services for, but I can't at this point because the people are not set up to see. They'll see the autism and they'll treat the autism, but they won't see that there's other stuff behind that, the functional behaviors. And the fighting with siblings is one of the huge issues with families. And you can speak to that even more, Nancy, I'm sure. But
yeah, we were talking about this yesterday, that in any family system that's stressed, the siblings of a child who's taking up all the oxygen and also potentially being violent can be traumatic for the siblings. I might invite any MAC individuals you know, Michael, Susan, Leslie, to
Mhm.
conversation, and actually any participant at all to jump in and kind of, I don't know whether that would be chaotic, but
Yeah.
I feel like, you know, you guys at MAC have a lot of experience in these areas, and we'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Mhm.
If anyone has anything to add about, you know, siblings, I think we recognize that they are in traumatic situations, and it's, they're probably the last person to get therapy, you know, in the family. They've got the affected individual, then you've got the parents, and the siblings are struggling along.
Right.
I thought this question about, oh, I see that, Michael, there's your link to the grid.
Yeah.
Question about identifying trauma is also really challenging. You know, I read something about how, I think this was in Jason Fogler's book, really highlighted the idea that often parents want an autism diagnosis because of the
Right.
two things. One, it's access to more services. If you have autism, the autism lobby has been so strong and powerful that they have, you know, really mandated a lot of services must be made available. And then also it doesn't have the stigma. If you tell a parent that a child's been traumatized, even if it wasn't them, you know, if you're pointing the finger at the school or someone else, parents feel tremendous guilt about having that happen on their watch. And it's very hard for them to accept that. And sometimes, you know, the autism diagnosis feels less stigmatizing. The question here is that schools are extremely defensive that something at school traumatized the student, schools finger at the parent. When DCF is involved, I've never seen a finding against a school. If the school is defensive, it's a challenge to get them to address the trauma at school. I totally agree. I think, you know, we've got schools who don't, again, some of the points I was making is that they're not taking responsibility for the entire context of the social environment for a child. Little boy I started the case with, the school, you know, refused to take it seriously. And again, DCF got involved, but the child was basically, I want to say nonverbal. He had language, it just wasn't functional language. And yeah, because there wasn't, he couldn't explain what had happened. No one took it seriously, DCF or the school. And they closed ranks.
I have to say, I've had a couple of cases where things have happened at school, and I would agree is that the DCF seems to be very reluctant to point the finger. And what has happened, but there has been some action. If you've got money and you're, you know, in a well-educated person, you know, you can make enough of a mess that the school will do something about it. But I have found that it's really directly related to the amount of pressure that a parent can put on the school system.
Bring lawyers, guns, and money.
Yeah, exactly. You know,
Yeah. Can you say a little bit more about that, about, you know, if the trauma does occur in school, because again, the impact of the trauma and learning, and you all were mentioning it, I'm just wondering about the kind of therapeutic interventions when something like that is happening during the school day.
See, this is why it's just so difficult. The situation is so incredibly difficult in a school setting to get everybody to sort of, that work of creating this trauma sensitive community is so important to do beforehand, because when you're trying to sort of fit it in afterwards, when you think something has happened, you know, I think, you know, the schools certainly have an issue about liability, like if something happened in the bathrooms, which often happens in the bathrooms, if a kid is being you know, bullied on the playground, this is on their watch. And if, you know, if they're not set up to be sensitive to the how this could come about and what it could look like, and the situation gets really out of hand, they're going to be really defensive, because it's, you know, that's why it's so important to get in there first. and really talk to the schools about, okay, here's a behavior. Let's think about this. It could be this, or it could be this. You know, it could be, you know, repetitive behaviors, or it could be traumatic play. You know, let's go back and take a look. How does this all sort of fit together? I mean, I think it's really difficult. And the problem is, even if you can get the teacher to understand and maybe the counselor to understand, what about the lunch lady? What about the teacher who's on duty in the playground? What about at the bus stop, with the kids on bus stop? I mean, it has to be this bigger picture in order to be really effective in keeping kids in the public school setting. So
and not to mention that if the trauma occurred in the public school setting, it's often inadvisable to put that child back in the public school setting without major modifications or something.
That's what I'm saying. Is that the schools have a really difficult time of making those major modifications because they have to do, it really has to be systemic. And that really got to do all the different, they can't just have a couple of different pieces.
Right, and have, yeah, we'll give you counseling once a week. And
yeah, no, that's not going to do it.
Right.
And I mentioned a specific resource that we've found helpful.
Yeah, please, Michael.
And I want to, you know, just say, and I'm also partly responding here to Katrina's questions that are in the chat that I see, but which I think are relevant to this conversation that we're having, that every school and every circumstance is different. So I'm going to mention a resource, but I mean, there's no guarantee that it will be helpful in any particular situation. But let me mention what the resource is. It's actually a guidance that has been put out by the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, which is about bullying, but which I think is really applicable to the issue of trauma as well. And in fact, we had some input into the drafting of this guidance, but it can be found on the DESE website, and it's about using the IEP process for an individual child to help create a school-wide context where they can be protected from bullying. And what the guidance does is it really walks through all of the school operations and gives ideas for how those could be addressed through the IEP process. So what does leadership need to do in the building? What professional development might the school or the child's team need? What resources or services might the child need? The IEP is already very good at doing that. What classroom approaches need to be used, what policies or procedures might need to be reconsidered in the school or might the child need accommodations to, and finally, you know, what family engagement practices will be most effective at supporting the child to succeed in school. And so again, while this guidance is focused on bullying, I think that action of thinking whole school through the IEP process is really helpful at solving some of these problems. And I think what's important about it is that because it's in a DESE guidance, it can be used with schools to say, hey, look, the state is saying IEP process. Exactly. So let's stop the defensiveness and let's actually think through these 6 areas and understand how we can use the IEP process to think a little bit more holistically about how to help this child have access to a school context where they're going to feel safe and supported.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, do you want to put a link to that up, Michael, if you have it?
Yeah, let me try to do that.
Okay, why don't we turn back maybe to some of the other questions too. Helene had a question about, she's out in Springfield and Holyoke area about long wait lists for therapy. This kind of goes back to the community piece, which I was also interested in. And families are on mass health. It's hard to get a diagnosis or documentation from a healthcare provider that the child's being impacted from trauma, and generally the children are not getting the kind of nuanced approach to therapy and diagnosis that you've all described. And this is very common, plus the language barriers and, you know, not having enough therapists that have that cultural and linguistic capability.
I do feel that, you know, just in general, very few people are getting the kind of nuanced approach to therapy and diagnosis that we would like to be seeing. You know, it's not something that's commonly available. One suggestion, you know, I was talking to somebody from AA&E the other day, and they were saying they found that if a therapist didn't understand autism, the therapy was generally useless. It just wasn't helpful. AA&E, that's Asperger's Autism Network. If you call them, they will help you find a therapist. I don't know who is conversant with autism. I don't know how far they go, but they do work in the Western Mass area. They do have some contacts out there. So that might be a resource.
I have to say that I've been working, I do a bunch of work in Western Massachusetts and also Southeastern Massachusetts this year. And it's really hard to find resources.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, even with, more, regular, typical kind of things of like language-based learning disabilities, there are like 3 schools.
Yeah.
And parents.
I think it's also hard to find resources in the Boston area that, it's not.
But I'm talking, but it's really, really hard out there. I mean,
we have a dearth of good people everywhere.
Yeah. I think it's something that's actually worth.
It's very hard.
I think we need to. I think as a people who are interested in advocacy, we need to do something about the whole Springfield, that whole. I think from Worcester North, it's just really, really, it's really hard, and we need to really talk about how to get resources out there. What's the most effective way of doing that? Like 1 or 2 providers, and that's pretty much it. There are 3 schools. That's it.
Right. As I said, yeah, absolutely.
I'm looking at Sita's question. Hi, Sita.
Yep.
And, I think the question is OCD different in kids with autism? I think it's very tricky to, again, tease out where OCD starts and ends and where, autistic, perseverative, impulsive behaviors start and end. I think I don't really have an answer to that. I think it would be, I should look up if there's research on it. I do think it's something that has to be looked at individually, case by case, because I think different, what looks like OCD in someone with autism could be perseverative, quirky behaviors. Again, impulse control lacking, so things get, more look compulsive, might be more impulsive.
I think one of the.
Let me finish. Wait,
Okay,
sorry. Let me just finish, Steph, because the second part of that question is ERP not the right treatment. The study that I found suggests that exposure response prevention is is not the right treatment for some kids with hypersensitive physiology. Again, the variability among people on the spectrum is something we always have to keep in mind. And so it's very hard to give blanket statements like this would never work with someone with autism. It might work. It is, the study that I found shows it doesn't work very well in people who have that hypersensitive, a super sensory sensitive person would have a harder time with ERP, apparently was the result of that study. That they, as I alluded to, it might be possible to modify ERP to such a, a glacial pace, right? Where your exposure to a feared stimuli, very, very minimal, slow pace, that might be effective. So again, I don't want to make blanket statements, something is or isn't going to work. But it is important to keep in mind those 2 things, the sensory sensitivities and the slower pace. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to finish that thought.
Sure. And you're right. That's important to say. I think one of the places that we start when we talk about OCD and different behaviors is the very basic question is repetitive behaviors their purpose is they're self-soothing. They make people feel better. They're enjoyment. They give people a break. But OCD behaviors are really different. OCD behaviors, we call them ego dystonic. They don't feel good. People know that they're weird and they're crazy or they're whatever, but they can't stop themselves from doing it. So that's sort of one of the things that's sort of where we start from. So when we ask about questions about that, the first thing we say is, how does it feel? What do you think about it? So that's one thing I think and
I think in reality, when you have someone with autism who may have diminished language capacity, again, still verbal, but kind of quirky language. So they're not able to talk about their feelings very effectively. It just becomes a little muddier. I appreciate the distinction, Steph. I just think in reality, sometimes
that's where that's when we start from sort of separation, I think.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think, that doesn't mean that there are other approaches that people can take to things when they feel like that they're doing stuff they don't want to be doing. It doesn't feel good to them. There are other kinds of, things approaches that we can take that might be much more easy to understand. Like one of the things that I've gotten really interested in is sort of biofeedback kinds of stuff. So just even being able to understand your physiological response to things and learn how to control that a little bit from just, there's a little thing that you can put on your hand. It's like, have you ever seen a mood ring? It's kind of like a mood ring.
Yeah.
And it can give you information. I mean, especially if you're someone who is having a hard time reading your emotions. It can be even just sort of doing this very basic psychoeducational kinds of stuff about, here's my body, this is how it works. Right. That can be just a great place to start from, and then sort of working up to more difficult things. Like, I really wanted to go into a crowd of people, but I can't do it. It freaks me out. Well, there's other ways of doing it besides response extinguishment. We can do other things. We're getting more of a playbook here, but it has to be really adapted to what the kids, what works for kids.
Yeah, and again, everybody is these. We start with the fact that people on the autism spectrum are all individuals, and a wide variability within that diagnosis. People who've had trauma is another wide variability, and we have to individualize all the time. I was going to comment to Shauna, yes, she said it's hard to start sibling groups because parents are so overwhelmed that siblings get ignored. And I think that's been our experience at NESCA too. We've tried many times even to just have parent groups, right? And parents are reluctant to take time out for themselves, even though, we talk about putting the mask on your face first, making sure you're healthy before you try to help others. But it is really hard with the stressful situations parents and siblings get.
Yep. I just want to note, I think, Mike, before you may have been responding to Katrina's message, and I didn't pick that up before because she was asking about advocacy at the IEP meeting. So I did want to just note that Mike has put up the link to the bullying guidance that he mentioned that will likely be helpful for folks. And then if you all are seeing perhaps the last, one of the last questions down here about would it be dangerous to refer adolescent students with substance addiction, PTSD, history of suicidality to residential treatment programs that does not specialize in ASD? This is from Jill.
So this is actually I have a couple of clients who are right in this situation too, which is, what do we treat the ASD? Do we treat the trauma? Do we treat both? I think that if this is where I have some, I think if the residential program is not familiar with kids with ASD, it's not the right place for them. But I don't think they're going to get the services they need if they go to a place that specializes in ASD and doesn't have hasn't have the capacity to treat these other things. So it's really difficult because where does that leave you? Who's left, really?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's the scary thing we find, is there just aren't enough good programs that can do both. I do, again, want to add, I think this is one of those things where it's hard to make a blanket statement. We would need to know about the level of autism in terms of, language capacity, as self-reflection. Will they be able to access the treatment programs that are in place? It would be the questions to ask of the treatment program, And
I think that one of the things as a neuropsychologist in this situation, that I would have to be extremely clear. Talk about kids with autism needing to do. I would need to be extremely clear about what this needs to happen. Like, do not just give, don't give a directive and expect that they'll understand what you always need to, you always need to check. Do you understand what I'm saying? Tell me what I just asked you to do, kinds of stuff. Just making sure that the things that we would commonly do, that most teachers would commonly know how to do with kids on the spectrum, that they understand this is the kinds of questioning that they have to ask and the kind of modifications that they need to make.
It might be useful if you were looking for something like that, it might be useful to have like an autism specialist consult to the program.
Right, that's a good idea.
Sure that they don't run into, you know, run into those kind of misunderstandings where someone is using language in a very concrete way or a quirky way, and that you know that they could get some consultation around the APP part if the other piece, if the substance abuse and the PTSD was really what you were working on right now. And Julie Brown's program is potentially helpful depending on the student's level.
I'm just going to say to Alex, there's a few people, including Jill, that can't unmute themselves, and I don't know if that's due to.
Just unmuted Jill.
Oh, yeah.
Feel free to
Thank
I just wanted, I was going to respond, but it's kind of a personal case, and you kind of addressed it, and this has been such an amazing program. I just want to thank you too.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'm interested in Susan Cole's question.
Mhm.
People would like to hear about the statewide level for creating safe and supportive trauma-sensitive schools. Yes. Can you unmute yourself, Susan? We can't hear you, Susan.
See, I got it.
Oh, okay, great.
Okay, thanks, Mike.
And Mike, please join in. So for, you know, our work has been to do what Stephanie and Nancy have been talking about, the part, like, how do we create safe, supportive, welcoming schools so that children on the spectrum and other children with disabilities can be welcomed and have the ecological fit? How do we make that happen? So a law was passed in 2014 called the Safe and Supportive Schools Law. And it's set up, like, are you hearing a feedback thing? Because I have it.
Yeah, you seem to be.
Can you unmute it from my other computer? Wait, I'll be right back. Okay, so
Someone asked, where is Julie Brown's program? And I can just answer that. For Susan.
Julie Brown doesn't have, right now she's working privately, and she has a website and a company, and she does consultation and training for groups and organizations mostly. So she's a you can see, I think if you just do Julie Brown, you'll find her, and emotional regulation skills system. It will come right up.
Susan?
can I just finish, or let
Yes,
Mike
please
finish
finish.
where we're going with the statewide advocacy? So there's a number of things happening that anybody is welcome and very welcome to participate on, especially to be a voice for students with disabilities. So as part of the law, there's the Safe and Supportive Schools Commission that anyone can attend. A tool is being developed for schools to use to create whole school safe supportive environments. A definition's been made. A framework's being developed in the state. It's going to be a framework for safe and supportive schools. And some of you know Denise Walk because she's been hired to sort of be the consultant for DESE to make it, you know, updated and user-friendly. So
Great.
to the extent we can get some voices in there from the disabilities community, we'd be really grateful because we're on the commission, but you don't have to be like appointed to it. You can just go and truly be heard. And Denise will listen to you if, you know, so there's that. There's a series of grant programs that go through the, you know, the law, and you know, over 100 schools have gotten grants, and they have to use this tool, and they're trying it out and they're betaing it. And DESE's supposed to be setting up a community of practice, so they've held several conferences on it. But it's truly in need of more folks who understand what Steph and Nancy talked about today. And if anybody's interested in participating, making school be something that would really be useful, because, you know, it's very hard to get to school culture through the IDEA.
Yeah.
We can get there, but really it's about changing hearts and minds. So anybody interested, email us over at Mike or me.
Okay. I'll be doing that.
Oh, we'd welcome it.
Thank you.
So I think we're just close to time right now. It's just at about noon. And I'm not sure if there were any further questions here, but again, you know, we all just can't thank you enough, Mike and Susan, if you'd like to make any, you know, final comments as well. But this has just been amazing. And we're just really so grateful.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And
Okay.
if anyone
Thank
does
you.
have further questions or want to contact us, feel free. Our emails are somewhere in there, somewhere.
Yeah.
In those slides. And you'll be sending
Fantastic.
slides.
Yeah, we'll be sending your slides. Anybody, Lisa was asking about thoughts on resources on racial trauma.
Yes.
So
Which we
that's
can't get to
also,
it, that would be really good.
yeah. So if you all have ideas or if there's things you want to pass along to us, we're going to be sending out the recordings, the recording of today's session along with the slides, and we're going to hopefully get that to everybody, because I know there were a couple of people who dropped on and dropped off of this and maybe couldn't access the full thing. So just rest assured this information will be there, and we'll probably be able to post it somehow through our website or through TLPI. And so we'll follow up with additional resources, the recording and the PowerPoint itself.
Great.
Great.
One last
right.
thing. Oh,
All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care.
Great.
All right.
yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe, everybody.
Yeah.
Stay healthy.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Stay inside.